So we've been seeing these images of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia says this was a war that it was forced to launch to secure its legitimate security interests. After all, NATO was literally knocking on Russia's doors with its interest to try and get Ukraine as a full-fledged member. And it's clear that on the ground, Russian military, its firepower, its naval assets, its air power are all clearly overwhelming Ukrainian troops on the ground. The Ukrainian ground troops are simply no match for the assault that we have seen from the Russian side. But the street warfare that's going on in the streets of Kiev and Kharkiv and Kherson is not the only warfare that is going on. Just as there is urban warfare on the streets of these big cities in Ukraine, there is also an information warfare on cyberspace. On Crux Decode this week, we will explore who is winning this information war. On Russian social media, if you were to take a glance at what people are talking about, there is a lot of anti-war propaganda that's been dished out. And it's been dished out by some very famous celebrities, Russian celebrities, on their Instagram accounts. You must have heard of Yuri Dud, the very popular Russian blogger. He has more than 5 million followers. He was seen earlier this week speaking out against the war. Then there was the travel YouTuber Anton Pushkin, who also has more than 5 million followers on Instagram. He put out a very heartfelt message speaking for peace and speaking out against war. Now, here's the interesting thing. Both Anton and Yuri have not been heard from ever since. And many Russians believe that either they've been asked to keep quiet or they simply have faced a severe backlash from a very nationalist response in Russia. Now, the problem is this. One of the videos that was shared by Yuri was about an alleged attack at a residential building in Kharkiv. Now, Russia is strongly denying that they have ever attacked a civilian building in the last few days of this war. They're saying very strongly that civilians have not been the target of their attacks. But the problem is this: the truth is getting drowned out. The facts are getting completely muddled. The problem is this, that ordinary Russians, and the rest of the world for that matter, are seeing these narratives, hearing their friends and their family talk about these narratives. They have powerful and influential and very popular young Russians speaking to them in a language that they understand, the language of the street. On the other side, the Russian government, though, is pushing what is seen increasingly as an impersonal narrative. All we are seeing is largely images of President Vladimir Putin, his generals, his ministers. They're sitting in vast meeting rooms. There is simply no attempt to try and connect to the average young Russian. Now, the problem for Russian propaganda and the propaganda machine that the Russian state has built over the last many decades is that they are having to be reacting to every story or claim put by the Ukrainian side. The Russian side is being seen as reactive and not proactive. And often they are slow in the reaction. They are very slow in putting out a counter to what the Ukrainian side is saying. Now, as a result of which, the Ukrainian side has been running away with the narrative in this information war, at least so far. Now, in contrast, if you look at Russian state television, and remember, television still holds sway in large parts, particularly in rural parts of Russia, in the Russian hinterland, they are still stuck with old programming styles that haven't really evolved from the 70s and 80s. It's almost like Stalinesque broadcasts, which are either anti-NATO or anti-America or simply anti-imperial rants. Now, state television does have a lot of power. It has the ability to reach a lot of people, but its programming techniques have not kept pace with the times. Also, more importantly, state outlets like Russia Today, Sputnik, etc. are banned across Europe and now, of course, across the Atlantic as well. So the rest of the world does not get to hear Russia's point of view, or what is it that the Russian government wants to put out there. Russia's narrative, in fact, looks more like broadcasts from the World War. It's almost like Vladimir Putin is a detached imperial czar who's directing his troops on a forward march. Now that is very different, and clearly it's no match for the very deeply personal stories that have been shot on iPhones by young Ukrainians, and it is going viral across social media, not just in Ukraine and in Russia, but right around the world. Now these are quickly uploaded, they go viral, and of course there are tens of millions of hits for these social media posts. Now for example, if you look at VKONTAKTE, which is the Russian equivalent, or what many call the Russian Facebook, it is highly controlled by the Russian government. Now you're seeing three different set of narratives there on VKONTAKTE or Russian Facebook amongst ordinary Russian people when they talk about the war. Now, number one, there is either total indifference, complete absence of any mention of the war. It's almost like, young Russians couldn't care any less about this war. There's absolutely nothing happening in their backyard in Ukraine. So that is one narrative that's very visible on Russian social media. Number two, there is another narrative of bleeding hearts, some of whom don't necessarily directly criticize the war or criticize the Russian government, but they're simply interested in sharing heart emojis. And number three, and this is significant, there are ones who are genuinely worried about possible bank runs, the ruble falling endlessly, food and other essentials getting costlier. Now this is something that young Russians don't want to encounter. Now one thing any ordinary person does not want, whether it's in Russia or anywhere else in the world, is hyperinflation. Not even Russians, who are relatively better off, because they fear that not just essentials, but also the relatively better off life they have lived over the last 20, 30 years could be taken aback because of hyperinflation. Now, look at what is on offer from the other side. The Ukrainian government, even weeks before the invasion began, they started documenting the Russian military build-up. They started putting out pictures on social media. They had videos that were quickly uploaded. They also directly debunked various Russian statements and provocations as utterly pre-planned. So they were well prepared even before this war began. So overall, what they managed to do is two things. Number one, they were showing to the world what Russia was planning, this massive military build-up and this invasion that was about to be launched. They were forewarning the rest of the world about this. And number two, they also took away the Russian ability to project itself as the victim in this case. Russia may well be the victim because, after all, they're threatened by the ever-growing tentacles of NATO. Their security is paramount, and their security was being threatened by Ukraine being pushed into the Western fold and into the fold of NATO. The Ukrainians also started pushing very early, even just as the war was beginning, stories of heroism, stories of ordinary Ukrainians standing up and fighting against the odds. So this David versus Goliath narrative had already caught on within the first few days of this war. We have seen tons and tons of footage of ordinary Ukrainians standing on roads and highways, blocking Russian tanks. But probably the most successful of these stories was that of fighter ace Ghost of Kiev. The hashtag Ghost of Kiev, in fact, became a worldwide trend. And here's the interesting thing, just wrap your head around this. This is a story that is part myth, part reality, but it got elevated to epic proportions. It was a little guy fighting the big monster, and who doesn't love the story of an underdog, even if it's not a real one? The Ghost of Kiev, like I said, is only part reality and part myth. Then there was the incident that happened at the Snake Island, the defenders of Snake Island and their iconic expletive-laden abuse to Russian soldiers. It turns out that none of these soldiers are actually dead. In fact, they're all alive and well. But here's the problem again. By the time Russia reacted to it, the Ukrainian version of this story had already gone viral. So nobody was willing to believe the Russian narrative when it was put out a day or two later, because they'd already seen the first video, which went viral, and you always have this confirmation bias. You always want to believe the little guy. And then there is the classic makeover of Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. Now remember, before this war began, Zelensky had an unfavorable rating of -34. He was one of the most unpopular Ukrainian presidents ever. But now, in the matter of the last few days, he has been transformed into a global icon. How did he do it? The Ukrainian side has been constantly putting out images of President Zelensky in military olive greens. Sometimes he's seen having tea with his soldiers. He's been putting out videos of him with his entire cabinet, saying that he's not going anywhere, he's staying put. Now, clearly, he wants to send a message both to his people that he's there, he's standing by his people. He also wants to send a message to the rest of the world that he is a leader who is willing to go down fighting. And what's interesting is the last big war that the world just saw was last year in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over Kabul. And people are already making very stark comparisons between Vladimir Zelensky and Ashraf Ghani, who was the former Afghan president who ran away when the Taliban took over Kabul last year. So what do we have? On the one side, you have a pretty stagnant propaganda machine that knows how to create chaos, it knows how to tear things up, but it does not know how to respond to hearts and minds. It does not know how to win over hearts and minds. It does not know how to respond fast enough, agile enough, so as not to let the other side run away with the narrative. Russia's military may be modernized, but the surround sound around it has surely changed, and Russia needs to wake up to this new information war.